Reading these stories made me realize I've had quite a few creepy encounters with stalkers in my lifetime, but the one that really stands out is the one I'm about to share with you. One day during my freshman year in college, I get a random Facebook request from this girl. I tried seeing who she was, but everything was blocked. But from her profile pic in the thumbnail, it looked like a girl I had just met in college, and I didn't remember the girl's name I had just met. Horrible with names. So I accept her friend request. I kid you not, literally 5 seconds after I pressed accept, she starts private messaging me saying stuff like, "Hi, my name. Do you remember me?" And thinking it is another girl from college, I respond, "Yeah, we met yesterday, right? Our mutual friends?" And she goes, "No, from high school." I then look through her pictures and realize, oh shit, it's not the girl I met yesterday. Who is this? Well, she kept sending me message after message of how she would always see me in high school walking the halls with these specific friends, and how I always parked in this particular spot during senior year. She even mentioned the first few classes I had. She wasn't even in those classes at all. This got me a little weirded out because she was right about all those details. I didn't even remember this girl at all. She started getting a bit defensive in her messages, saying things like, "And I waved at you, but you never saw me, and that upset me." And, "Yeah, I saw you walking to class, and I looked at you for a long time, but I guess you never saw me, LOL. Well, I tried being as polite as I can, and I told her that I really don't remember her at all. My high school had about 4,000 students, and that I was sorry. She then asked me out. This is still only 10 minutes after I accepted her friend request. I declined politely, and she was trying every move to ask me out over and over to see if I would give in. I finally just turned off my computer and started doing homework or something. Flash forward a year later, and I find out a friend of mine from elementary school is dating her. I found that strange, but I didn't think anything of it and actually calmed me down a bit, knowing she might get off my case. One day while I was sleeping at my house, I woke up to the doorbell. It's about 10:30 a.m., and I walk out of my bedroom to make sure it's not anybody I know because I look like crap. But as my mom opens the door, there she is, standing right there with my friend. I give my mom that look, but my mom, being polite and hospitable, invited them in. I'm thinking, great, now she knows where I live. They stay for a good 2 hours, and she just keeps talking to my mom and I while my friend is just sitting quietly on his phone. When they left, I finally explained to my mom who that was, and she did feel bad. My mom thought she was kind of off anyway. But then my mom sees a friend request from this girl on Facebook, which I thought was extremely weird. A few months later, I found out she breaks up with my friend, and she starts talking to me again about the whole breakup, and I really didn't care. What was weird is that she got my number somehow and started texting me. I talked to a friend about this, and he told me that this girl started talking to him too, and would ask about me, and ask him if I want to date her. It was really weird. I finally told her no yet again, and she went off about how her 3 therapists aren't going to be happy about this, because I am making a mistake rejecting such a great girl. Yeah, I'm pretty sure she hasn't stalked me in a while now. I mean, I haven't heard from her since. I've had friend requests on Facebook from her again, but that's about it. My friend has convinced me to share this here. It needs some backstory, so apologies for the length. I was in a relationship with whom, at the time, I thought was the perfect man for me. We traveled all the time and discovered a lot of incredible places together. We were madly in love. People could see it. Strangers stopped us on the street to comment on what a radiant couple we were. Just after our 3rd anniversary together, he decided he was sick of living in the suburbs and would be moving downtown, closer to his business. He asked for my input, so we walked to look at apartments one day. We walked into a dream place after seeing some really terrible ones. He got down on one knee and said,
"I knew you would love it. It's ours already. Would you marry me?"
Of course, I said yes. I was bursting with happiness. We moved in straight away, the most blissful 6 months of my life. We planned an awesome wedding. It was a dream. I had just been laid off my job, so I had plenty of time to be a homemaker, and he appreciated it. He thanked me every morning for his breakfast and clean clothes. He fantasized about our future children and all the great things we do together. Then one night, he came home from work a different person. He refused to even touch me or look me in the eye. Out of nowhere, he said,
"This is not what I want for myself. Give me the ring back and leave, please."
It made no sense, but he wouldn't talk to me. He let me grab a coat, handbag, and money from my drawer and told me a cab would be ready downstairs. He literally pushed me out the door as I cried and begged for an explanation. I had nowhere to go, but he didn't care. I ended up at my mother's house, screaming hysterically. My whole world had collapsed. He refused all my calls. All my possessions were in that apartment, and he didn't give a shit. I had to borrow clothes from my sister, take hand-me-downs from friends, never recovered any of it. The wedding cancellation fell on me, too. It didn't take long to find out that he had been seeing someone else, and she became pregnant. They married 3 weeks after he kicked me out. I fell into a deep depression and lost the will to live. I was skeletally thin, and my mother made me go to inpatient and work on moving on. It took me about 6 months before I actually started leaving the house and interacting with people again. Then it happened. He started incessantly calling and texting me nonstop. 60+ texts per day.
"Can we talk? Can we meet? I just need to see you. I miss you so much."
I knew I didn't have the mental strength to face him, so I ignored it. A barrage of emails followed. He had made a mistake and wanted to get back together. Pick up where we left? What? He was married with a baby on the way. He didn't just get drunk and kiss a stranger, but that was his whole attitude. I didn't reply. He started sending pricey gifts to my mother's house. I asked her to decline them all, say that she didn't know where I was. His emails became deranged rants. This woman had scammed him, forced him, threatened him. He never meant to cheat on me, let alone leave me. He didn't even know how he'd ended up marrying her. He actually hated her. I honestly wondered if he was hooked on hard drugs. Then my friends started complaining. My ex, his employees, his brother and/or cousin had started contacting them to try to set up a surprise meeting with me to fix things. It was unnerving. His friends turned up at my sister's workplace. His cousin followed my mother in a mall. My best friend was being followed constantly. He somehow found out where I was receiving therapy and turned up a few times, demanding information on my treatment and appointments. Police had to be called. I started to fear for my safety and became extremely paranoid. He left me a voicemail detailing how his wife was in labor, but as soon as she was done, he was filing for divorce. Could we please meet that night? He appealed to a lot of our happy memories, and then with no remorse said,
"The kid can have my name, but I want nothing to do with him, ever. I just want you and our days road tripping. I miss everything about you, all the time."
It felt so callous and manipulative. I replied in a text, "Stop looking for me. Stop calling. Just stop. Now go tend to your wife and love your firstborn." This somehow made things worse. Almost everywhere I went, a black van would be waiting for me. I recognized his employee. He looked sadly at me and gestured an "I'm sorry." His instructions were to follow me until he found my new boyfriend and to convince me to go back. His wife and baby had been kicked out of the apartment and he was waiting for me. He wouldn't give up on us. LOL, what? This man was everywhere I went. My mental health declined rapidly. Finally, I decided to get away on a long vacation and save my sanity. I shut down all my social media and I took a cab to the airport at midnight. Not 6 hours after landing in Vancouver, I had a string of emails from him demanding to know where I was. He had also flown to Vancouver and would not quit until we met and got back together. I could not believe it. Hoping he wouldn't figure out the rest of my itinerary, I told him I was willing to meet up at Stanley Park and arranged a time, which was to time my next flight for New Zealand. Things turned for me since then, and I ended up moving there. I'd be lying if I said I didn't do it to get away from him and that shit show he was putting me through. It's been 10 years, and only recently did he tone it down. He stalked me on Twitter for a while, tracked my government job email, came to Auckland twice in hopes of bumping into me, and occasionally still sends me messages regretting the fact that we won't be together forever, that my daughter is not his child, and assuring me I will always be the love of his life. All right, dear, but let's not meet. When I was a kid growing up in a very small town in the 80s and 90s, my parents often left me and my little sister home alone for a few hours at a time to run errands. My mom had 2 brothers, and we lived in the same town as one of her brothers and his family. Being a close-knit family, my cousins and I were always over at each other's houses. The adults would leave us alone a lot back then. It was standard to tell kids, "Don't open the doors for anybody and don't use the stove," and we never thought anything about it. After my parents divorced, it happened more often as both my parents worked different shifts at their jobs. My sister and I lived in town, and my cousins and my grandma lived outside of town with only a few neighbors nearby, so my sister and I got the best of both worlds, city kids and country kids. Because we lived in such a small community, everyone knew everyone else, and I think we all felt perfectly safe that nothing bad would ever happen, and if it did, our neighbors would help us. Around the time I was 8 or 9 years old, I began to get strange phone calls. It would be a man's voice on the phone, and these calls would almost always come when I was home alone. This person would tell me that they could see me, that they knew I was alone, and that they were coming to get me. When I get these calls, I'd usually just hang up without saying anything. Of course, it terrified me, but I was too scared to tell my parents. I was scared by the calls, but I also liked getting to stay home alone. Being left to take care of my sister made me feel grown, and I didn't want my parents to stop leaving me in charge. Stupidly, I kept the calls to myself. One day while my dad was at work, my cousin, who was a year older than me, was at my house. We were watching TV and playing when the phone rang. She answered it, and her face went pale. She hung up and started crying. I immediately asked her what was wrong, and she shook her head, saying, "I can't tell you." I pressed, and she finally told me about how this man would call her a lot when she was home alone, always telling her he knew that she was by herself and he was gonna come get her. I was shocked. I explained that I had been getting the same calls, and we immediately agreed that it had to be one of her older brothers or their friends playing a mean joke on us. We calmed down and kind of laughed it off. I didn't get another call for a while after that, so I almost forgot about it. In the summer between my 6th and 7th grade year, my grandma had taken a part-time job and my mom lived in another town. So my sister and I were both home alone almost all day, every day, while my dad worked. We spent our days outside playing in the yard, riding bikes around the neighborhood, and tanning in our backyard a lot. One day, my sister was gone to a friend's, and my cousin was back in my house. We were listening to music and dancing in the living room when the phone rang. I picked it up, and there it was, the voice. At this point, I was 12 years old, and I had developed a little bit of an attitude. When the man told me he knew that we were home alone, I laughed and said, "Liar." He waited a moment and said,
I can prove that I know that you're alone.
I laughed again, a little more nervously this time, and said, "Oh yeah? Then do it." His response was,
I love that little yellow tank top you're wearing today.
By this time, my cousin had turned off the music and was watching me, so she saw when the color drained out of my face. I was freaking out. I had just gotten a new outfit and was wearing it, a yellow tank top and jean shorts with matching yellow and pink patches. I yelled, "Leave us alone," and slammed the phone down, my heart racing. I started crying and told my cousin, "It was him. He knows that we're here by ourselves." I ran over to shut the living room curtains, and my cousin said, "I think that we should call somebody." I agreed, but instead of calling the police, she picked up the phone and tried to call her mom at work. We got no answer. I called my dad's work and left a message with the gate guard to have him call me. As we were debating what to do next, I heard the gravel in our driveway crunch under the wheels of a vehicle. I ran to the window and peeked outside to see a small red car sitting in the driveway. I didn't recognize the car, and I didn't recognize the man and woman inside it. In our tiny little town, even if I didn't know someone's name, I'd surely know their face, but I didn't know either of them. I froze with fear as I watched them talking to each other, and my cousin ran to lock the back door. We had no weapons and no real way to try to defend ourselves other than my softball bat, which was outside on the carport. As my cousin came back into my room, she hissed, "We have to hide." My cousin hid in a small space between a tall bookshelf and the wall, and I threw myself behind our recliner, which faced the window. I watched in horror as the woman walked up to the front door. Instead of knocking, she tried the knob. I tried to quiet my breathing, convinced that she might be able to hear me, and watched her shadow through the curtains as she walked around our carport. Sure enough, I heard the doorknob jiggle. There was a pause, and then the door shook as if someone was trying to force it open. I covered my mouth, and I forced myself not to scream. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped and everything went quiet. I was too afraid to move, so I just waited. I have no idea how much time passed, but eventually we heard the car backing out of the driveway. Once I got the courage, I ran to peek out the window again to make sure they really had left. I saw no trace of the red car, but I was still racked with fear. I told my cousin she could come out, and we hugged each other in relief. Even though we were scared to go outside, we decided to get our bikes and ride to the office my aunt worked in. Once we were there, we told her everything, the phone calls and how long they'd been happening, the red car, and the description of both of the people inside. She immediately called the police, and we had to give our statements about it all. When my dad got home from work, he asked me why I'd called the gate guard, and my aunt filled him in on everything. And from that moment on, we weren't allowed to stay by ourselves again until I was probably 16. We never heard anything else on the case, and we also never got any more phone calls again. It's been years, and I think about the situation often. We never found out who made those calls or who those people in the red car were. The phone calls could have just been some mean prank, and those people could have just been trying to simply rob the house or something, but the coincidence that day was crazy. I have no idea if the man kept watching us as we grew up, but the whole thing definitely made me paranoid about a lot of things, and I always make sure to keep a weapon near me at all times when I'm home alone. Now, as a single mom, I'm forced to leave my kids home alone occasionally, and I'm overly protective with them, giving them tons of instructions and rules about what they can and can't do. They may roll their eyes at me, but I know the dangers of the world, and I'd rather be safe than sorry. So, to the man and the couple in the red car, let's not ever, ever meet. So, just as some background, I am a male and currently 25 and still living within 15 miles of my old house. This happened when I was around 8 or 9, making my sister at the time 5 or 6. We lived in a quiet neighborhood that, once I grew up, I found was actually a lower income part of town. However, we had some wonderful neighbors, and it was thanks to these neighbors that a lot of potentially negative situations were avoided. At the time, my dad was working an 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. job, and my mother was a secretary at a hospital, which meant that during the day, she was often at work. Usually my sister and I had a babysitter, but once I reached about 8 or 9, I began to be old enough to look out for us without a babysitter. Now, mind you, this was the 90s, which certainly were not safe, but were much safer than they are now. Also, we had the previously mentioned neighbors who generally did a good job of keeping an eye on us and our house. This particular incident was one of the first times I was charged to babysit my sister. She was in her high chair eating whatever my mom had left for us when I got a knock on our front door. Now, this was strange since we never got visitors on a regular basis, other than the boy across the street who would want us to come out and play, but he usually just yelled my name while knocking. I was young and naive and decided to open the door. There was a locked screen door beyond that. I left that closed and locked. Outside was a middle-aged man. I hardly remember his facial features or even body type. I remember his yellow shirt and dirty jeans. "Can I help you?" I asked innocently. No alarm bells going off yet.
Hey there, are your parents home?
All right, first alarm bell. My parents teaching me not to trust strangers rushed through my head, but I still didn't quite fully grasp the potential danger here. My mom went to the store. She'll be back any minute. Weird half-lie. I could have said that she was here, but in the shower, or that she was lying down upstairs. I'm glad that I didn't tell him that she wouldn't be back for quite a few hours, but looking back, it's scary how naive I was.
Well, that's no problem. Hey, so look, my dog went missing, and I think it went into your backyard. Do you mind if I come in and we can go check it out?
Okay, so I may have been dumb, but I wasn't that dumb. There was no way in hell I was letting this stranger into my house, especially with my sister there. She was my first thought. Sure, I didn't want to have any harm fall on me, but she was my sister, and it was my job to keep her safe. I should have closed the door right then and there, but once again, I went with a less safe, but still not totally stupid route. Well, the gate should be unlocked. If you want to go check in the backyard, you can, and promptly closed the door. Now, of course, I was very curious if there was a stray dog in my backyard. Dogs are great. Even with the weird guy being around, I was pretty interested to see how his search in the backyard went. So I decided to check the back window and see if there was actually a dog, and if so, if the man would catch it. Now, at this point, I'm sure that you figured out that there was no dog, and when I looked out the back window, I could see almost the entire yard, including the gate. The man wasn't there. This was mere seconds after I had closed the door on him. I waited for a few minutes, but he never showed up. After about 5 minutes, there was another knock on my door. This time I was much more wary, and I didn't like this guy showing up. I was pretty tired of the whole ordeal, but I still hadn't fully grasped the situation. I kept the chain lock on the door and cracked it open. "Did you find your dog?" Again, I can't remember his facial features, so I really cannot recall his expression, but I remember his tone was a bit desperate, as well as annoyed.
No, I looked all over the yard and I couldn't find him. I have a picture in my car if you want to take it, just in case you see him.
Nope, no more. I still didn't understand abduction, but I certainly wasn't going to go anywhere outside of the house with this stranger. I told him that he can leave a picture in the mailbox and we will keep an eye out, once again promptly closing the door. What followed is really what creeps me out to this day. Looking back, I was freaked out that I had come that close to exposing my sister and myself to danger, but this scared the shit out of me. Suddenly, there was more knocking on my door. Not the screen door separating the door itself. Like I mentioned previously, the screen door was locked, and unless that was open, it was impossible to knock on the door itself. It freaked me the fuck out, and I took my sister to my bedroom and crept back out to the kitchen, where I could see out into the front yard, and I saw the man quickly getting back into his car, while my saint of a next-door neighbor, Joan, stood on her front lawn, smoking and watching him intently. It took a long time for me to add it all up, and honestly, I had forgotten about it for a long time. When I finally remembered it all, I couldn't even believe my own memories. I'm still debating with myself to actually tell my parents now. I wouldn't want to unnecessarily upset them, but maybe it's an important story to tell my 2 younger sisters, one of whom is getting married soon, just as a life lesson. If anyone has any advice, I would love to hear it. Either way, Mr. Yellow Shirt Man, yeah, let's not meet ever again. Also, thank you, Joan, wherever you are. You saved me on multiple occasions, and I didn't even know it. Edit. I forgot to mention this. It turns out he had ripped a corner of the screen door and had unlocked the screen door that way. My dad later just thought it was wear and tear, or us kids being kids. But yeah, I forgot to mention that portion. Pretty creepy, looking back on it. This happened a long time ago. At the time, I was living alone in a first-floor apartment. My girlfriend had been sick at the time and ended up in the hospital dealing with a rare disease. She recovered fine from it, but during those weeks, my life was pretty much go to work, go to the hospital to be with her, come back to the house for dinner, and then bed. It was a Friday night and I was alone, so I decided to distract myself by reading and watching some videos on YouTube. Hours passed, and at 3 a.m., I was in bed with my iPad in hand, almost falling asleep. Then I heard it. I knew that sound pretty well. You see, outside, right in front of my bedroom door, there was a long corridor that leads directly to the kitchen. This apartment was in a building built in the 50s, and the kitchen door was old and had become slightly bent. That meant that whenever you turned the doorknob to open the door, it would snap out of its place with a distinct clack sound. That was the sound I had just heard. A lot of thoughts ran through my mind in that moment. Had I dreamt it in my semi-sleeping state? Or maybe the sound was real, but what happened was that the doorknob internal mechanism broke and it opened by itself. Or, of course, maybe someone was in my house and they had just opened the door. At this point, my heart was racing and I started considering my options. I had a broomstick next to my bed. You may ask why I had it there, and to be honest, I had it exactly because I lived alone and thought that one day I might be in a situation like this where I would need a weapon. My girlfriend even used to joke about it, but I guess that my paranoia was now paying off in the most unfortunate of situations. So I decided I was going to take this stick on one hand and grab my cell phone on the other. I would open my bedroom door while calling 911, and if no one else was in the apartment, I would just apologize to the operator on the other end of the line and explain the situation. However, back in those days, my cell phone wasn't yet a smartphone, and it had this feature I found interesting, even though I never used it. If you press on a couple of specific keys, it would start ringing like somebody was calling you. It was meant to be used when you wanted to simulate that you were getting a call to get out of a boring conversation or a tough situation. Clumsily, I pressed the keys and the phone started ringing. I quickly shut it up, but it now became clear inside the apartment that I was awake. If someone was outside my bedroom, they certainly heard it. What was going to happen? I stopped for a few seconds to hear my surroundings. Nothing. It was dead quiet. I decided to continue with my plan. I dialed 911 with one hand, raised the broomstick with the other, and quickly opened the door. As soon as I did that, someone sprinted in front of me in the corridor and quickly got into the kitchen, closing the door behind them. I screamed, "Hey!" and started pursuing, but a split second later, I thought, stop. What if there's someone else in the apartment? What if another intruder sneaks up on you from behind? In front of me was the corridor to the kitchen, but on my left was another corridor that led to the living room and office. The office had the light on, so the intruder had been there, but I didn't know if he had company. I took a step back into the entrance of my room so that I wouldn't be caught off guard.
Sir, are you there?
The 911 operator was calling me on the phone. I quickly explained to him what was happening. I gave him my address, and he told me the police were on its way. They had a patrol car nearby, so I should just wait. Then he hung up. The apartment was dead silent. I was terrified. There were only 3 things that I had been able to notice in the intruder. He had a light-colored sweatshirt with horizontal black lines, dark hair, and he smelled really bad. In fact, the smell was still in the apartment, and I could still sense it. The police arrived after 7 or 8 minutes, which felt like ages. The apartment door was next to the bedroom, so I managed to quickly approach it and unlock the door to let them in. I explained what happened to the police, and they said that we should go through the whole apartment and check every single hiding place. They had seen situations before where a burglar had hidden himself for a long period, even after the house owners had called the police, to later attack them. The apartment wasn't that big, so it was easy to conclude that no one else was hiding there. In the kitchen, it was obvious what happened. It had these large windows that faced the back of the building, where we had a small community garden. I had left one of the windows open, and next to it, on the outside, there was a large drain pipe along the wall. The intruder used that pipe to climb up to my window and get in. The police left to go look around the neighborhood for someone matching the description of the sweatshirt I described. While they were gone, I could still smell that horrible odor the intruder had left in the apartment. After around 20 minutes, they came back. They couldn't find anyone. The burglar was long gone. Luckily, he didn't have the chance to steal anything while he was in my apartment, but the audacity. I mean, he must have seen the light on in my bedroom through the edges of the door, and still he tried walking past to steal something from the office. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I went to the garden in the back to try to find any further clues about the intruder, but I couldn't find anything. A neighbor in the building next door was at the window, and I called out to her. I told her what happened, she just smiled and said, "Well, welcome to the neighborhood. We all have stories like that in this place. You should never leave your windows open, and maybe you should consider getting some bars to protect them." The next day, I bought a motion alarm and installed it in the kitchen. I never had another experience like that in the apartment, but, to be honest, I never slept the same way in that bedroom, traumatized by those events. At night I would fear hearing again the sound of the kitchen door snapping out of its place. A few years later, I moved out to a larger apartment in another neighborhood. This time it was on a 7th floor, so much harder for intruders to get in through the windows. So, to the intruder that came to my apartment and smelled really bad, let's not meet ever again. This happened about 10 years ago, but still creeps me out when I think about it. At the time, I was an 18-year-old female living in a more crime-prone area of downtown Savannah, Georgia, with my older sister, then 20 female. We lived together in this super old, decrepit house and both worked at a nearby club. Not that it's super relevant, but we were both exotic dancers at the time, so our work hours were odd, 7 p.m. to 2 a.m., later or earlier depending on the night. Her boyfriend who had been living there was in jail at the time. I know, we were real winners back then, LOL. Generally, we would both work the same shifts. On this particular evening, I was tired and I didn't feel like going in, so she went without me. We didn't really have internet or cable, just DVDs and my cell phone, so I would frequently spend my nights on the porch, listening to music and smoking a few cigarettes. It was starting to get late, maybe 10 to 11 p.m., and I noticed a figure in the distance, coming up the sidewalk. I didn't think much of it. A lot of people walk everywhere downtown, and we had a pretty large homeless population. But then I noticed he seemingly noticed me and crossed the street to the sidewalk that ran in front of my house. I didn't budge. I wasn't scared of much back then. I had seen a lot of crazy shit, so an unassuming man approaching at night didn't bother me in the slightest. As he got closer, I could see that he was a dirty, older gentleman, likely homeless. I stared down at my phone. A few seconds later, I looked up, and that's when I saw him, a few feet away from me, on my porch, just standing there, staring at me. I got a chill down my spine. I didn't want to threaten the guy and potentially escalate the situation, so instead I just say, "Hey man, what's up?" He immediately started talking faster than my brain could keep up. I assumed the guy was sacked out of his mind on drugs or something. I had no clue what he was saying, but a few words were clear. "Hey baby, hang out, fine, stupid bitch, kill." I froze. I decided to try and play it cool by asking the guy if he wanted a cigarette. He nodded, and I slowly got up to pass him to get to my front door. I explained to him that they were inside, and he would have to leave after I gave him one, as my sister's boyfriend was home, and I'd get in trouble for having people over to their house without permission. He seemingly accepted that. I handed him a cigarette and went to close the door. Something told me to hurry, and so I did. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I looked through the peephole and saw him feeling in his pockets like he was looking for something. I could hear him mumbling gibberish and cursing while trying to open my door. I panicked. I ran to the back door to let our 3 large dogs in, a Rottweiler and 2 pit bulls. They're sweet, but very loud and scary sounding if you don't know them. Their barking seemed enough to scare him away. I called my sister over and over until she picked up. I was freaking out, explaining what happened. She told me to lock all the doors and she would be home in a few hours. Hindsight, I wish I had called the police, as I was terrified of the rest of the night, and every sound startled me even after my sister got home. I never saw the man again, and I stopped sitting outside alone at night. A week later, down the street from us, a young girl, early teens, was drugged into an alley while waiting for the city bus, and was drugged, beaten, and SA'd. I still don't know what came of that. They never caught the guy. I called and reported what happened to me. I still wonder what would have happened to me had I not gone inside. Shortly after, we moved away and got different jobs. A few years ago, I was 17, just graduated from high school, and I got my first job at a Christian camp near Yosemite in California over the summer. Mainly the people I worked with were great, really sweet Christian college kids, the good kinds. There was one guy, though, I'll call him Carl, who I frankly did not like. Carl was tall, handsome, and charming. He had curly golden brown hair and a smile that could stop your heart. His eyes, though, were dead. He never got those little crinkles in the corner of his eyes when he smiled. It was like the top half of his face was just dead. There were things I didn't like about Carl right off the bat. His eyes, for one, that dead smile of his. He also never asked for anything. He tried to twist your arm. He just very softly, very slowly tried to manipulate the situation until you almost felt like you owed him. Each time, it felt like part of my brain shut down, like it slammed a door shut, and there was a very clear feeling of no, this is not right. Save him some food, but do not walk out into the woods to give it to him. Something is wrong. I got along with most of the little cliques at camp. No one really disliked each other, as far as I knew. We just kind of broke off into groups based off of what we liked to do in our free time, or who we worked with the most. Carl, though, seemed to make friends one-on-one within a clique. By the time he left the group, it was decimated. They were fighting, not speaking, didn't trust each other. I know this isn't a lot of evidence, but I'm trying to paint a picture of a man who just seemed wrong. One day, everyone in camp decided to go to Fresno. We were tired of camp food and wanted real dinner, maybe see a movie or go bowling. I was off work last. Now, at camp, we had a sign-out sheet. Being so close to Yosemite, we often went hiking, so if we left, we had to put our name down, along with where we were going, when we left, and when we should be expected back. This way, if something happened, they would know when to start looking for us. So I put all of my info on the sheet and headed down to the parking lot. My friends had all divided up into their cars. I didn't drive, and I jokingly asked if they forgot about me. They said that Carl had said that I could ride with him. I looked around, but didn't see Carl, although I had seen his name on the sign-in sheet. All the hair on my body stood on end. I was terrified to get in the car with this guy alone. He felt so wrong, so off, just not right. I don't know how else to say it. My friends were telling me I had nothing to be worried about. It would be fine. I saw Carl walking towards the parking lot, the dead smile on his face, and everything in me was screaming not to get in the car. I said that I was tired and I wanted to stay in tonight, and Carl laid the charm on thick, telling me what a good night it would be. I owed him because of God knows what, flashing that dead smirk. I refused. He got angry. He told me I didn't need to be such a bitch about it. I thought that we were friends. The lot. I refused. Finally, everyone figured out that I wouldn't be persuaded. I hugged one of my girlfriends goodbye, whispering in her ear not to ride back with Carl under any circumstances. When they all left, I walked back to the area with the sign-out sheet to cross my name off, since obviously I wasn't going anywhere. I saw the sheet, saw where my name was, and my heart dropped. My name had already been fucking erased. I go to university 2 hours away by ferry from the mainland where my family lives. Sometimes on weekends, I would go visit them, which would require me to take a 23-kilometer bus ride to the ferry terminal. This bus ride was usually very boring and long, so I would try to make the best of it. Where I live, we have double-decker buses, and I would always sit at the top and listen to music. One Friday, on my way to the terminal, I was up on the top level as usual, when a man who looked to be about 40 came up to sit. I made note of his presence, but I didn't think much of him other than he looked pretty beat up. Shaggy hair, stained brown hoodie, a silver chain on his neck, but I try not to judge. It's important to note that at the time, I was 18 years old, and I am a small female. I don't ever want to have to be hyper-aware or judgmental, but I was brought up to always take note of who is around me, particularly men, just for safety. The man sat multiple rows ahead of me, and in the beginning was initially minding his own business. I was just listening to music and looking out the window, minding mine. It wasn't until partway into the trip that I noticed that he had moved one row closer to me. Weird, but whatever, maybe his seat was dirty or something. He then proceeded to move closer and closer until he was in the seat directly in front of me. It's important to know that the top level of the bus is only him and I. Suffice to say, I was getting uncomfortable. Still giving him the benefit of the doubt, I decided to phone a friend and have a conversation just to break the uncomfortable silence. I text my friend SOS, which we do when we need the other to call us for whatever reason, and he calls me and starts a normal conversation. It was at this point that the man decides that he wants to start talking to me. I tell my friend to hold on, and I take out my earbuds to hear what he's saying. He starts asking me if I know any good place to get a haircut, and I say that I don't. I start to put my earbuds back in when he asks what a girl like me is doing taking this bus alone. It wasn't late yet, but it was getting dark, so maybe he was just concerned for my safety? LOL. I told him I was going to the ferry terminal, everyone on the bus is, and try again to put my earbuds in. He continues on, telling me his life story about how he's in the military, how his kids don't talk to him, showed me his dog tag, and told me that he rides this bus back and forth every day just to have something to do. He has no intention of taking the ferry though. This is important for later. He's growing increasingly annoyed that I'm not reciprocating the conversation. He tells me it's quite rude to ignore people when they're just trying to have a friendly conversation. At this point, I'm starting to get quite creeped out. I politely inform him that I'm not trying to ignore him, but I'm on the phone with someone and I would like to resume my conversation. This irritates him, and he asks who I'm calling, to which I respond, a friend. He notices the male name on the phone and makes a weird face. He tells me to hang up and then asks to see my phone to find a hair salon where he can get his hair cut cheaply, which I obviously refuse. I then get up and try to move to the bottom level of the bus so that I'm not secluded with this weirdo upstairs alone anymore. My friend on the phone has no clue what's going on as I collected my stuff and start moving. He tries to tell me that it's not my stop yet, but I ignored him. I go down to the front lower level and stand near the bus driver until we reach the final stop. The man had come down the stairs and seated himself close by, but didn't try to talk to me further. Most likely he didn't want to suss out the bus driver. I thought it was over, but alas, no. I reach the terminal, pay for my ticket, and go to the waiting area. You can't enter the waiting area unless you have proof of a ticket purchase. Well, guess who comes down the escalator? Mr. Dog Tags himself. My heart sank. There are a couple people in the waiting area, so I wasn't too worried about my immediate safety, but I was more worried about having to be trapped on a ferry boat with this guy for 2 hours. He paced up and down the walkway outside the washrooms, repeatedly checking to see if I had moved, briefly ducking into the men's room and coming back out after a couple of minutes. He goes up and down the escalator a few times and continues to catch my eye, either smiling or just staring. I'd had enough at this point and started looking for other passengers that I could sit with for security. I see a woman in her mid-40s and my teenage instinct to seek maternal security kicks in. I bring my bag and politely ask this woman if I can sit with her. I quietly explain what was happening, and this woman goes full mama bear. Bless her soul. She told me that she had noticed the man too and got a bad feeling. She had 2 daughters around my age. She insisted I sit with her on the ferry too, just in case. The girl sitting across from us in the seating area overheard and offered her support as well. We boarded the ferry together, and I didn't notice the man as we boarded. I assumed that he had left the terminal, as he said that he never intended to catch the ferry in the first place. As we're sitting on the ferry, my heart drops when I see him coming towards our seating area. The nice mom assures me that she'll handle it if he dares approach us, but he noticed that I'm not alone anymore, and I guess decided to do a lap instead. We later saw him trying to bother another young girl, but luckily her boyfriend returned from the food lineup and the guy took off pretty fast. For the rest of the ferry, he was just sort of lurking, checking in to see if I had gotten up or left my group. I did not, even though I had to pee really bad. Not worth it. The girl we were with eventually flags down a ferry worker and informs him of the suspicious person, and Dogtag hightails it to the other side of the vessel. When we reached the other side, the mom insisted on walking me directly to my dad's car in the pickup zone before leaving the terminal herself, and that was the end of it, thankfully. I wish that woman nothing but wonderful things in her life. She was so kind and protective. I genuinely don't know how the evening would have played out without her. I don't know what this man's plan was. I don't want to. But being followed on 2 forms of transportation is definitely a new one for me. This happened to my ex and me in 2014. We were seeing the movie The Edge of Tomorrow at the Cineplex. When we got into our theater, it was somewhat crowded. We decided to sit at the top row near the center. We sat down and I noticed a guy getting up and moving seats to the aisle seat on the row below us. People were still seating, so I didn't think anything of it. The movie starts and I get this weird feeling. I look out the corner of my eye and see that he is still staring. I look back at him and give him a fuck off look. He gets up and walks down the aisle and out of the theater. Cool, I thought, and I go back to the movie. A few moments later, the guy shows up on the other side of the theater, comes up the aisle, makes his way to the row of seats in front of where we're sitting, and sits down in the seat directly in front of my ex and me. I think, WTF? A couple minutes pass and he turns around in his seat and stares at my ex and I. It's at this point my ex notices him. She says, "Can we help you?" To which he didn't respond. I'm getting creeped out at this point, but also angry. He continues to stare. I try to ignore him and watch the movie, but he's staring at me and my ex, still turned around in his seat. I say something along the lines of, "What is this dude's fucking problem?" to my ex, loud enough so that people around us noticed. The guy still stares. I tell the guy to stop staring at me and leave us alone. We get a few shh from the people in the theater, and nothing seems to faze the guy. My ex is creeped out by now and says that we should leave. I'm furious because this has been going on for 20 minutes at this point. Looking back, I realize that we should have told management and got them involved. That would have been the smart choice, but we get up and leave. My ex needs to go to the restroom, so I stand in the lobby to wait for her. A few moments after we come out of our theater, the guy comes walking out. He sees me and stops. I'm pissed off completely now, and I start walking over to confront the guy. He walks off and outside. I go back to the restrooms until my ex is ready to go, and we leave. We walk outside, and I notice that the guy is standing off to the side a few yards away on the left of us. My ex and I park to the right. I thought about confronting the guy outside, but I'm ready to just have this night over with and move on. We are walking to the car, and I see in my peripheral vision that the guy has started walking a few feet behind us. I'm enraged at this point and turn around and yell, "What the fuck do you want, motherfucker?" or something in that neighborhood. He stopped when I turned around and just smiled. I notice he has a camera like a GoPro in his hands and is filming us. I confronted him about filming us and demanded to know why. He doesn't say anything and just smiles. I know now we were giving him what he was after, but at that time I didn't understand why this guy was messing with us. My ex pleads with me to leave and get out of there, so we go to our car. The guy continues following and filming. We get in the car and he stops at the bumper of the car beside us. We pull out and he gives us another smile before we drive away. I worried for a little after that he would try to identify me by my license plate number, or if he might have followed us, but nothing came of it. I've met my share of creepers and weirdos since then over the years. I think that the fact that I was in high school at the time and didn't have much experience dealing with those kinds of things is why this encounter stood out to me. So this is a story from many years ago, but I still remember it as if it were yesterday. I was a student and I played volleyball in a college team. One day, we had a very late match quite a distance away from where I lived. Us all being students and almost none having cars, it was quite a challenge to get there and back. I could drive along with the coach, a male student some years older than me. Everything went great until we went back. The coach lived about 2 miles away from me, and he thought it was just fine to drop me off at his address and let me walk home alone. By then, it was past midnight. They assured me I was going to be fine, so I started walking. It was a well-lit road with flats on the right-hand side and a cemetery and trees on the other side. There was no traffic. About halfway, a white car approached me and slowed down the moment the driver noticed me. My heart jumped immediately, but I told myself I was seeing things, so I went on. A few minutes later, the same car drove from the back, very slowly. I saw the car checking me out, and I totally freaked. The car drove on and turned into a sideway. I ran towards the nearest flat and hid behind the wall and waited. And yes, after a few minutes, the same white car came back again, driving very slowly where he expected me to be, but as I was hidden, he couldn't see me and he sped off. I was terrified by then and was contemplating my options. The flat where I was completely dark, but the next flat had one window where I could see the light burning. I figured that would be my best option. There were no cell phones back then. Yes, I'm that old. I decided to run as fast as I could to the apartment with the lights on. I was in tears by that time and shaking from top to toe. I rang the doorbell, but no one answered. I rang again, and now someone looked out the window. A middle-aged woman looked down on me, and she looked startled. She opened her window a little bit and asked what I wanted. I rattled about what just happened and begged her if I could just use her phone to call my boyfriend. She reluctantly agreed and handed me her phone through the window gap, making sure I couldn't enter. She was obviously freaked out as well. I called my boyfriend, but he didn't pick up. He probably was already asleep. I was shaking and crying, and the white car came passing by again. The woman saw me freaking out and then decided that I was no threat to her, and she invited me inside. She gave me something to drink and gave me some time to calm my nerves. After a while, she offered to drive me home, and I happily accepted. She dropped me off right in front of my apartment and made sure I got in safely. Of course, the next day I paid her a visit. I brought her some gifts and profusely thanked her. She told me how spooked she was herself, but that she was glad that she could help. About a week later, it was on the local news that a guy was arrested who had raped several women that he picked up in his white car. This happened about a year ago, and I've only told a few people about it, but for some reason, I found myself thinking back to it a lot lately. I was walking home from Walmart. It was close to 10 p.m. Our town is tiny and uneventful, and every establishment, apart from the couple of 24-hour convenience stores, close at no later than 11 p.m. So usually, at this hour, there aren't very many people out. That night, however, as I was walking, I suddenly heard what sounded like a man and a woman yelling. It was coming from a parking lot a little ways up in the direction I was walking. I couldn't make out anything that was being said yet, due to still being a relative distance away, and I initially presumed it to be an average verbal dispute. As I got closer, though, I quickly realized it was far more serious than a mere lover's spat. The man was repeatedly shouting threats and derogatory obscenities at the woman at the top of his lungs, and the woman in turn was screaming at him in an extremely anguished tone to leave her alone. I had no doubt that the man was attempting to harm the woman, if he hadn't already done so, and quickly dialed 911. By this time, I was close enough to the parking lot where I could be seen by them if they happened to look in my direction. So while on the phone, I kept my voice down and tried to outwardly mimic the body language of being in a casual phone conversation. This guy undoubtedly came across as the retaliatory sort, and if he knew that I was calling the cops on him, I could be his next target. Because their screaming continued during the phone call, the dispatcher heard it and rightfully picked up on how serious the situation was. I described my location to them as concisely as I could, and within minutes, 2 police vehicles arrived. One was a van and the other was a standard squad car. In the time between the phone calls and the cops arriving, the people had walked away from the parking lot that they were initially in and crossed to the other side of the street and began walking towards another parking lot a short ways down in the other direction. When they reached the point of being directly across from me, the woman looked at me, made eye contact, and pleaded, "Call the cops." I gave her a quick, subtle nod and made a slight, quick gesture with the phone in my hand to assure her that I was doing exactly that. She seemed to get the hint, because immediately after I did that, she screamed, "Your ass is going to jail," at the man. It turns out that the other parking lot that they were headed towards was where the woman's vehicle was, and she had been trying to make her way to it, but the man kept following her. This parking lot was where the cops met up with them. I, of course, continued to stay at a safe distance on the sidewalk that I was already on the other side of the street. The cops first interrogated the man, who loudly argued with them and tried to play off the situation as a heated verbal dispute. With how much he raised his voice, I could make out most of what he said, even at the distance I was at, and he essentially claimed that he had recently broken up with her for cheating on him, and that she kept following him. I stood there thinking, this is such BS. I hope the cops see through it. There were 3 officers on the scene in total, and 2 of them stayed with the man, while the 3rd went over and talked to the woman. She spoke much more softly, so I could not hear what she told them, but apparently it was very damning, because the next thing I saw was the man getting cuffed and put into the police van, which then drove off. My guess would be that he was being taken in for questioning, at the very least. After the 3rd officer finished talking to the woman, she was able to get in her vehicle and drive away safely. This assured me that at the very least, she was in stable enough condition to drive steadily, which I was relieved about. After she left, the third officer walked over to me and asked if I was the one who had called them. I confirmed that I was. He asked me a few more questions, such as if I know either of the people personally. I did not, and any other details I could recall, and then took down my info for records. I remember continually thinking to myself that I very likely saved that woman from being severely harmed, or possibly even saved her life. Like I said earlier, few people were out at that hour in our town, and if I hadn't happened to be walking home from Walmart at that moment, who knows if there would have been anyone else around to intervene. I've not encountered the man since this incident, thankfully. I sincerely hope the woman was also able to stay safe from him and is in a better place in her life these days. My family owns a boutique in a very big city here in the south. Our boutique is located in a very wealthy neighborhood, but that doesn't say much. If you go not even a mile north, south, west, or east, you'll enter rough areas of the city. With that being said, we have a lot of homeless, drug addicts, and sketchy people in general come to our stores. When these people come in, we are also nice, respectful, and treat them like we would our normal customers. We try not to judge by their appearances. However, we don't tolerate the begging, stealing, or soliciting. So, we've all had our share of weird encounters at our store. However, I think my most recent encounter was the creepiest. Last week, getting ready to close, I was tidying up the store when a woman came in. I greeted her as normal, and everything seemed smooth sailing. She was looking around and engaging in conversation about some of our pieces, when all of a sudden, things changed, quickly. The vibe and feeling of the room just felt eerie, so I moved behind the counter just to create a barrier. She began by grabbing one of our candles that has the saying, "I love you to the moon and back," across the front. I think this is what originally triggered her. She began talking about her family and how she would read the book, "I Love You to the Moon and Back," to her triplets that she didn't know she even had. She then started telling me about her life being married to Ryan Gosling and how she recently killed him because he kept poisoning her and hiding her 3 sets of triplets and daughter from her. At this point, I was just listening. I didn't want to upset her any more than she already was. When she finished, she began walking the store again, telling me about how she just got out of jail for stabbing someone. And at this point, she gets about 4 feet from my counter and tilts her head, looks me in the eyes, and says,
I really feel like chopping you up right now.
We were the only 2 in the store at the time, and I was in shock. I had no clue what was about to happen. Up until then, she was just rambling. This was the first incidence of her showing aggression. Luckily, seconds after that statement, another customer, one of my regulars, came in, and the woman, who just told me she wanted to chop me up, grabbed her stuff and walked out the door. My regular could feel the tension as I rushed behind her and locked us in the store. So, lady who wants to chop me up, let's not meet ever again. This happened when I was in my early 20s. I was working in a retail store in a mall, but there wasn't enough hours, so I asked if there was anything else I could do, and my boss told me that the location at the other mall needed more help, so I could go there on my weekend. I decided to take the bus route that was a bit longer, but that I didn't have to make any transfers, so I got up early and caught the earliest one I could. The bus ride was fairly normal. I got to see parts of the city I hadn't seen before. I did notice that the bus eventually went to a more dingy neighborhood. There was more trash everywhere, abandoned buildings, houses and cars, etc. I noticed it, but I felt like I was safely on the bus, and my destination was in a nice neighborhood. At some point, an elderly lady got on the bus, and I noticed that no one was getting up to offer her a seat, so I gave her mine and went to go hold the pole next to the side door of the bus and continued on my way. While riding, I remember looking at a guy next to me and asking if he knew about how much longer it would take to get to my stop. But before he answered, someone hit the buzzer to get off. The doors next to me opened, and I felt hands on my free arm, grabbing me and pulling me. On reflex, I immediately clenched up because I generally don't like any physical contact with strangers outside of a greeting handshake, and I really think that reflex saved my life because it took my brain a few seconds to register that someone was trying to pull me off the bus. A tall man in a white tank top, blue jeans, and white tennis shoes had come out of the back of the bus, grabbed my arm, and tried to drag me off the bus. He had pulled me down to the second step before I even understood what was going on, and I was just barely still hanging on to the pole. The arm he was grabbing had my purse on it, and I actually tried to shake my purse down to him so that he'd let go, but he had no interest in my purse. I had just about started calling for help when I felt someone grab my waist and pull me back up towards the bus. The man trying to pull me down must have realized that he couldn't get me without this dragging out longer than he expected, so he finally gave up and ran off, and that was it. The guy ran off, the door shut, and I vaguely remember hearing the man who saved me say something along the lines of,
"You would die in that neighborhood."
and I had apparently gone into some kind of shock because I only remember saying, "Oh." I don't even remember thanking him. I didn't say anything to the driver. I didn't contact the police like I should have. I don't even remember my shift at the other location. I don't remember the ride home. It was like I was numb. It was when I was at home, had completely showered and gotten ready for bed in my nightgown, that I sat at the edge of my bed and thought, did I almost get kidnapped? I almost got kidnapped. I have a lot of regrets about all of this. I regret not contacting the police in case that guy goes after another woman. At least women would be aware that he was out there. And I regret not thanking and keeping in contact with the nice person who saved me. I actually posted an article in my local CL in hopes of him somehow hearing it and knowing how grateful I am to him. Well, anyway, to the guy that tried to take me off the bus, let's not meet. And I hope you get caught. I'm currently writing this because I'm too scared to go to sleep after what happened about 2 hours ago. So I, a 22-year-old female, am a dog sitter, and I stay in my clients' homes instead of keeping their dogs at my own house. I'm currently on a job and have been for about a week. Ever since the first night I got here, I felt super unsettled to be in the house by myself at night. I didn't think there was any reason to be, because the house is in a gated neighborhood, in a decent part of town. It's right next to a freeway, so fairly busy streets outside the neighborhood. I figured it was just because of all the antiques in the house, making it feel haunted mansion-esque. Anyway, the house that I'm staying in is kind of on the outskirts of a gated community. It's in a little cul-de-sac with no neighbors on either side or behind. There's also a pedestrian gate to come in or out of the neighborhood right next to this house. Yesterday, when I was leaving for work in the morning, I noticed that the pedestrian gate was wide open. I figured someone went for a walk or something and made a note to see if it was still open when I got back in the afternoon. Sure enough, it was still open, and I went over to close it. The gate, however, was in a locked position, so a little lock bar was in place, so it couldn't latch closed. The bar would block it. I didn't have a key to use this gate, so I was unable to unlock it in order to close it and relock it. Yesterday night after that, I just had the worst gut feeling that something was going to happen. I also have severe anxiety, so often just write things off as that. A bad trait to have as someone who regularly stays in houses all by myself. Anyway, I finally got to sleep last night and everything was totally fine. Today was normal and I was home from work all day, so I didn't even leave the house. I should mention that this house has a gated courtyard out front. I keep it locked at all times, so there's no way to get into the front or backyards of the house unless I let you in, or you jump a wall or something. Around 9:45 p.m. tonight, I had just gotten into bed with a pup that I'm dog sitting and was about to fall asleep when I heard someone start knocking hard on either a door or a window of the house. There are about 5 sliding glass doors leading to either the courtyard, backyard, or side yard, and I couldn't identify exactly which way it was coming from. The dog, of course, went crazy, and the knocking immediately stopped. Like I said before, there's no way to get in the house with that courtyard gate locked, so whoever was knocking had to have hopped a wall into either the front courtyard or backyard. And if it was a neighbor or something like that, the dog shouldn't have scared them into stopping. I was obviously terrified and called my mom, who told me to call the police, and she and my stepdad headed out to come over. They live 10 to 15 minutes away from where I'm staying. The police dispatcher was a woman who totally understood how I felt and told me to stay in the bathroom, and if any knocking happened again before the officers got there, to call back. After I hung up with the police, I tried to call my mom back, but my phone suddenly had 0 bars of signal, which was just the terrifying cherry on top. The police came and checked out the perimeter, didn't see anything suspicious, and left. The part that really scares me is that it had been raining this evening, so I was reading with my bedroom sliding glass door open before bed. I usually go to bed later, but I wanted to sleep early tonight, so I was reading with my door wide open, and then took the pup out for a potty in the back about 20 minutes before the knocking. It freaks me out that I could have been outside or vulnerable if I had stayed up later like usual. Sorry if this was anticlimactic, but it scared the shit out of me, and now I can't sleep. When I, 20 female, was around 11 or 12, I would hang out at a park across the street from my house with friends. It's not a super popular park or anything, more just the neighborhood side streets nearby, but it's a proper playground. A friend and I were there more towards the evening, maybe like 4 or 5 p.m., sitting at the top of the playground looking up at the sky. We hear someone walking on the path nearby and turn to look. There's this decent height, thin dude in a hoodie walking our way. Mind you, we're now the only 3 people in the park. We stay where we are because we figured, oh, the guy must be walking the path through the park, past the playground, and out the other end. Nope. Guy comes off the path and starts walking across the wood chips over to the playground. At that point, we get up, kind of chuckle, and just shift around nervously. He slowly starts climbing the stairs, dead-ass eye contact the entire time. This is where we were really nervous. Us being at the top of the playground, we go down the big slide, start walking around the side back to the bottom to see if this guy is actually following us, or maybe it's just some dude wanting the playground. Guy goes up, comes down, walks around the side. Now, we took like the longest way around, weaved a bit. This guy does the exact same thing. At this point, he seems to be speeding up to catch up to us. My friend and I look at each other, and we just book it the F out of there. The guy starts running after us until he sees that we're running to a house. Mine. Immediately turns around and beelines it out of the park from where he came. This is probably the closest I've ever been to someone potentially trying to kidnap me, or someone with me. Definitely not the only close creep encounter I've had as a kid, though. Thank God this park is close to houses. I know this story may sound fictional. A lot of people don't believe me when I tell it, but I can assure you that the other person involved also witnessed what occurred that strange night. This happened 11 years ago with an ex-girlfriend. It actually changed our relationship for the worst, and we ended up breaking up a few weeks after. Nonetheless, I still remember this like it was yesterday due to how unexplainable it was. My girlfriend at the time wanted to surprise me with what she said was an overnight surprise trip. I obliged and felt like I was a pretty lucky guy for her to do something that required that much planning. After packing a duffel bag full of clothes and toiletries, we left for what I thought was a resort or some kind of hotel stay. 2.5 hours passed when we pulled off a main road and headed down an off-road path. I asked her if this was a camping trip, and she replied yes. To be honest, I was disappointed as I didn't really like camping, and not to mention, I wish I knew to pack my hiking shoes. I didn't complain, of course, because it was still a romantic gesture. 15 minutes on this rough road, we finally pulled into a camping ground. The first thing I noticed was that there wasn't really anyone around us. It made sense though. This was really far off the beaten path. I was actually surprised her car had made it that far out, considering how harsh the road was. Anyway, we made a fire pit and she cooks dinner. Everything is going just fine, and we are really feeling each other. We of course take it to the tent as the sun goes down, and we are vibing off each other. Yeah, it's exactly what you would expect would happen, as we begin moving things along, as young college-age kids do. This is where the first strange occurrence happens. I hear scratching noises on the side of the tent. I try to remember if we set the tent up next to brush. Maybe the wind is causing branches to rustle against the tent? Oh well, that's the woods. Maybe it's a bird or something else. It stops rustling and we continue chilling as if nothing happened. Then things escalate in a strange manner. It's like the wind stopped and the environment became silent. We both felt uneasy, causing us to sort of get knocked out of our playful mood. She laid next to me as we tried to concentrate on listening to hear if there was a bear or some other animal in the area. Then it happened in an instant. Something akin to an explosion hit the tent tremendously hard. I could compare it to, say, if a log was thrown like a battering ram against the side of a tent. I say this because it literally pushed the material in forcefully and felt dangerous. A surge of adrenaline lit through my body as I felt like something violent was outside the tent. I never knew if I was a flight or fight guy, but I guess my next action gives me some idea. I yell aloud, "Give me the knife and the flashlight," as I scramble up and unzip the tent with tools in hand. My first thought was that I was going to confront some psycho that was messing with us, perhaps with a baseball bat or some kind of battering weapon. I kid you not, I launched myself out of that tent and stood up in a flurry to confront my attacker. A few breaths pass as a cold feeling sets in. I do a 360 scan to nothing but silence and darkness. Maybe it was a branch that fell on the tent? Nope. There was absolutely nothing on the ground where the thud was heard and felt. "Hello?" I yelled again and again, to no response, until only a moment later, in the silence, a chill shot up my spine. "Get the keys and get out of the tent," I said in a frantic tone as my girlfriend listened and now joined me. I looked at her car that we arrived in and noticed that it was about 30 yards out by the shoddy off-road path. She didn't even need to know what I was thinking, as we both just started a speed walk towards it. You might be thinking at this point that I'm overreacting. But truly, I cannot describe the terror that washed over me when I looked out into the darkness after investigating the tent. I could feel like something was watching me, and to top it off, it was eerily silent. I know she confirmed my suspicions when she started for the car immediately, without question. Our instincts were telling us to get the hell out of there. The walk to the car was unnerving and felt like a football field away, but we finally got into the car. With keys in hand, I took the driver's seat. After turning the keys led to some relief as the engine started. Instinctively, I locked the doors and turned the headlights on. We sat for about 3 more seconds trying to rationalize what was happening when my girlfriend started exclaiming, "My laptop is moving. Something is in the tent." She said this because she brought her laptop to serve as a lantern after dark. We of course left it in a hurry, as well as other items. I saw what she saw. It was items being rustled around 30 yards away. Without further hesitation, I put the car in gear and started down the rough road. As I tried to calmly drive the car down the dirt path quickly but carefully, it was a very rough road and I did not want to get stranded out there. The strangest thing happened next. A loud piercing, ringing noise rang from inside the car's cabin. I turned the radio on and off. I checked the windows. I asked my girlfriend if her car had ever made such noises. She replied no. I asked her again if she could hear it, as maybe it was just me being under stress, and she said, "Yes, I hear it. I don't know what that is," in a confused, panicked tone. Now, I wanted to write this off as a car problem, but if you were in there with me, you would have described it as some kind of bell continuously ringing. It didn't sound like any car noise I had ever heard. My next instinct as I grew up as a pastor's kid, I just remember praying for 10 minutes, as I was convinced it was supernatural or a demonic event. We endured the screech for 10 grueling minutes. As to my relief, it ended suddenly. It didn't fade out or go quiet. The loud ring literally stopped in an instant. I can't describe the feeling in that car when it stopped. It is so strange to look back and remember that I felt internally that the ordeal was over once the ring stopped. Everything felt normal again. The panic, the chills, all of that went away in an instant. We ended up down the road another 45 minutes and finally stopped at a trucker diner. We slept in the parking lot, or at least she did, as I was still on edge from the adrenaline dump I just went through. In an attempted bravery the next day, we went back to the camping site as the sun was up. We investigated but saw no tracks or anything, except for the contents of the tent tossed around, but still accounted for. I was hoping they were missing so I could write it off as people screwing with us and plundering our tent, but that didn't seem to be the case. We were packed up and gone in less than 10 minutes, as the area still felt weird. Haven't been camping since. I would go again, but next time I want an RV, or at least a relatively known location, with others around. This place was on the remote mountains of Payson, Arizona, far from civilization. When we were teenagers, my friends and I would go out and explore, do dumb things, basically just be kids. We have a lot of odd experiences and stories that I plan to tell, but this is just one. So, during the summer when I was 17, me and my 3 other friends decided to go on a camping trip. I'll call those friends Tia, Jean, and Aria. We didn't want to go to an actual established campground because we weren't trying to spend a bunch of money, and we just liked creepiness overall. Aria lived near the woods anyway, so we decided to go deep into those and camp there. We wanted to go for the weekend. A fun thing that we did splurge on was a huge tent that could easily fit all 4 of us and probably another person if we tried. Now, the first night was fun and simple. We did the typical roasting marshmallows and told stories, not exclusively spooky ones, but past experiences too. Tia was the first to turn in, and she did so early because she had been working late the night before. No one had a problem with it. A few hours later, like 2 a.m.-ish, I think, it was Jean and Arya awake. I had gone to bed second, but I woke up to Tia shaking me awake and looking distressed. She said something along the lines of hearing jostling outside the tent, but further behind it, so not where Arya and Jean would have been. She didn't suspect anything malicious. She immediately thought it was a bear. This part of the story is a little lost to me as I was half asleep, so I'll just tell how my friends did. I peeked out of the tent to investigate, as if that would help. The noise was supposed to be behind us, and I saw Jean and Arya frozen scared. They were looking behind the tent. Arya noticed my groggy head emerging from the tent, and she shook her head and put her finger over her mouth, telling me to be quiet. Arya whispered something to Jean, and they both ran into the tent, shaken. This is where I start to wake up a bit more. Tia explains her side of the story to them, and they say that they saw a woman in the distance looking at them, but trying not to be seen. Apparently, when she noticed they saw her, she took off in the other direction. All being scared now, we decided to sleep in shifts. This worked up until it was Arya's turn, and she passed out. The next morning, when we all stepped out, we decided to look around as a group. We saw nothing out of the ordinary. Being spooked, we all agreed that we didn't want to camp out there anymore, so we decided to just spend the rest of the weekend at Arya's. But as we were emerging from the woods, we saw a middle-aged woman with blonde hair walking down the road. She caught a glimpse of us and quickly turned her head away and started to walk faster. We just looked at each other. I think it was me who asked if that's what the woman looked like, and Jean said they couldn't really see specific features in the dark, but she was about that height. I just wonder if she had any malicious intent, or what her point of view was. Either way, I only ever camp on established grounds, now. Me and some of my good friends were going to hike in 5 miles on a Friday, fish an inaccessible section of the river for a state record, and hike out Sunday. I say it's inaccessible because the whole river gets pushed into a canyon for 3 miles, and the only way that you can fish it is to stay in the water, occasionally swimming between holes. Well, something happened and they couldn't come down till Saturday morning. I hiked in, made sure the trail was marked well for them, set up camp in the afternoon, and took off for the river to catch supper. I fished a few holes below camp to catch supper, and ended up catching 4 over 20 inches. I cooked them up in a frying pan I kept hidden back there, and the sky started clouding up. Long, black, rolling clouds with a touch of green. I double-checked my tarps, dug a shallow ditch around camp, made sure my tarp was hung well over the fire, and then it came all of a sudden. It was blowing sideways, but I didn't worry. I know how to build strong shelters. I broke out the bottle of bourbon I rolled in the center of my bedroll, leaned back in my hammock, and watched it just pour down. The lightning was constant, and it started to crack all around me. I had a good view as twilight was starting of the tracks across the river. With a boom, I watched the lightning strike the tracks and run right up the rails for 50 yards. I took a few long drinks out of the bottle and dozed off as the storm calmed down to a drizzle in the dark. I woke to the steady dripping of rain falling off the timber of a storm long since passed in the pitch black. The fire had died down to just a glow of hot coals, and I didn't set my lantern out in the rain. I dug in the pocket of my hammock for my flashlight. I had the sense to put my pistol and my flashlight before I dozed off in my hammock. As I was rolling out of my hammock, I heard a sound in front of me within 15 yards, and then a squeal to my right and a growling purr. I soon heard it all around me. The hair started standing up on my neck as I couldn't place what kind of creatures made all these sounds, or could be that numerous. I sat real still, waiting on a moment for whatever it was to stop where I could spot it with my flashlight and my gun. I turn on my light and see eyes through the sights of my gun, eyes about half a foot setting on the moss, squalling, and I smiled. In my buzzed, sleepy state, I had left the remainder of my fish sitting in the skillet on the rocks beside the fire, and a whole family of raccoons had sniffed them out. I took a few moments to stroke the fire with some dry pine. I took the skillet full of fish and threw them just out of sight of the light from camp. With one loud clack, the mama called all the little ones to eat. The fire kept them too scared to come any closer, but they must have been hungry. I dozed back off in the hammock. The next morning, I woke up and walked to where I had thrown the fish. They had cleaned up every fin, bone, and drop of grease, and moved on with full bellies. Many years ago, before kids, rescue animals, a mortgage, and a husband, I was a travel writer in Europe. I did most of my trips alone. This story is from the first time I visited Prague. I had never been to Prague, and the trip was last minute, so I had little time to prepare. My travel partner had dumped me in another country, and I was determined to make the best out of the trip by visiting a place I'd never been. Upon arrival at the train station, I visited the accommodation office and asked for a hostel not far from the center. In my early 20s, winging it was part of the fun. These days, I'm far less adventurous. The hostel they sent me to was a sprawling, crumbling, slate-gray Art Deco building on a nondescript street about a 10-minute walk to Stare Mesto. The inside was probably beautiful at one time, but by the time I checked in, it was full of shabby, mismatched furniture and cheap stained carpet. Most of the light fixtures were broken, leaving everything but the lobby dark and gloomy. It smelled of standing water and dust. I found my room, a double for $12 per night, and made note of the fact that I had a roommate. She wasn't there, but on her side of the room there was a suitcase, dressed neatly folded across the back of a plastic chair, a scattering of makeup containers on the beat-up desk, and a stack of German fashion magazines on the bed. I had no plans or goals on this impromptu trip, so I spent the afternoon exploring Old Town Square, the Jewish Quarter, and Wenceslas Square. I purchased some Czech crystals for my mom and painted eggs from a street vendor for myself. I also made reservations for a sunset dinner cruise for one. At around 6 p.m., I returned to my room to shower, change clothes, and unload my purchases. When I left my room about an hour later, there was no indication that my roommate had returned at any point during the day. After the cruise, I stopped at a tiny bar on Tinska and had a glass of wine. I'd heard horror stories about the dangers of Prague, but I felt no more trepidation than I did in any other large city. Sure, the cobblestone streets, fog rolling off the Vlata, backlit Gothic architecture, and winding alleys made me think of Jack the Ripper and Dracula, but in a good way. It was nearly midnight when I returned to my hostel, so I was surprised to find that my roommate still hadn't returned. That wasn't uncommon, though. Backpackers are a fickle lot. She could have gone on a short overnight trip and just left her stuff behind. hooked up with a guy or girl and was holed up at their place or hanging out at another hostel, so I was surprised but not concerned. I took another shower before bed, however, and was surprised to find that things in the room had changed up in my return. Her bed was neatly turned down, the magazines had moved to the nightstand, and the dress was gone. The strangest thing, though, was the addition of a pink silky nightgown spread across the bed. My bed. Maybe she thought she still had the room to herself. I didn't see how. My shopping bags, clothes, and toiletries were in plain view. I gently moved the nightgown over to her bed and then settled in for the night, as I wrote in my journal. I assumed that she was in the shower or somewhere nearby, so I expected her return shortly. After about an hour, though, her side was still empty. I needed to use the restroom before I went to sleep, so I made one last trip down the hall. The building was unusually quiet. There weren't the regular sounds of chatty backpackers, the clinking glasses, or music that would normally leak through the walls. There was nothing. It was hushed, like a church after the congregation has left. I found myself practically tiptoeing back. My room was near the end of the hall, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the corridor was darker than before. The few working lights were blinking as they struggled to stay lit, and it reminded me of a funhouse. A tightness began to fill my stomach, and I subconsciously quickened my steps. There wasn't a soul behind me yet. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone gaining momentum on me. The only sound was the soft thud of my flip-flops as they struck my soles. I was flooded with relief as I flung open my door, but that didn't last long. Everything was exactly as I left it, except for the silky nightgown, which was now back on my bed. Sleep came in fits and starts. I left the lamp on for a while, still convinced my roommate would be right back, but the shadows it cast made the room even spookier. It was too dark with the lights off. I finally slipped into a deep sleep when I suddenly heard the door open. A man stood in the darkened doorway, the hall light behind him showing just enough for me to see his contorted face.
"I didn't mean to,"
he sobbed.
"You have to help me."
Too confused and disoriented to be scared, I sat up, scrubbed at my eyes, and reached for the lamp switch. But once the room was light, I saw that the door was closed. There was no man. I quickly bounded off the bed and went for the door. It was locked. Nobody could have entered without a key, and the hallway, empty. I passed the rest of the night fully clothed, sitting up in bed and with the light on. Though I'd paid for 2 more nights, at 7 a.m. I gathered all my stuff and went down to the reception desk to check out. "By the way," I said to the 20-something receptionist, "my roommate never returned. I'm a little concerned." She picked up the room key, looked at it hard, frowned, and then glanced at her computer. "What room were you in again?" When I repeated it to her, she looked back at her screen. "Ma'am, that room's been empty for 3 weeks, and it's been cleaned since then. We only have 6 people in the whole building. The hostel has since been renovated and is now a luxury hotel." I realized that we didn't physically meet, but I thought it relevant since I seemed to have met someone. Someone entered and left my room. I want to start by saying that this isn't the first bad experience I've had dog sitting, but it's definitely the worst. So I started dog sitting back when I was 13 and made good money doing it. I'm currently 19, and this happened when I was 18. I set up an easy way for people to contact me about dog sitting. I put out a post on Facebook and Instagram about it often and would get people in my messages asking me to dog sit. I got a notification from Instagram one day stating that someone was trying to message me. I accepted it, and the message said that me and my wife are looking to find a dog sitter while we go away for a week to Florida. You will have to work the 4th to 11th this month. We will pay you $300 for the week. You're welcome to stay at our house or go back to your own home. I started talking back and forth with this man, and we're going to call him Mr. Brown for the sake of privacy. So I agreed to take the gig and told him that I would stay at his house for the week. Once I got to his house, I was introduced to his 2 dogs, Mina and Letty. Mina was a little Yorkie and Letty was a blue hound. I was shown around his house, which was surrounded by 76 acres. I live in a farm town and I live on 32 acres myself, so staying here didn't really freak me out. The closest neighbors were pretty far away, and you would actually have to drive there if you wanted to talk to them. They told me the rules and when to feed them, blah blah blah. Then Mrs. Brown told me about the nearest neighbor. In her words, she was a nice person, just a little drugged up and confused. She mentioned how sometimes she would pull into their driveway instead of hers, and would end up mistaking Mrs. Brown for her dead daughter. Hearing this made me feel pretty bad for her, and I knew all too well how hard it is for parents to lose their child because of how my parents were after losing my brother in a car accident. Mrs. Brown said that she shouldn't do anything bad though, and if she came up to the house, just point her back home, and she would leave with no problems. After they left, I was down to watch movies and just chill with the dogs. The first 2 days were fine with no hiccups. The 3rd day, however, the old woman, who I'll call Miss Rose, did pull into the driveway. I came outside as she was getting out of the car. She looked up to see me, and immediately she got back in her car and left. I chalked it up to her realizing that it was the wrong house when she saw me and went back inside. Later that night, I got a call from Mrs. Brown asking if I was okay. I said yes and asked why. She then went on to tell me about how she got a call from Miss Rose and that she said that there was a robber at their house. I explained what happened and she just laughed and said that she must have been confused and forgot that they were out of town. I ended the phone call making a note to go over there tomorrow to clear the air about me being a robber. Once I went to bed that night though, things got crazy. I woke up around 2, hearing a light scratching sound that almost sounded like ticking coming from outside the window. At first I thought it might have been a bird or some sort of night creature and left it alone. But the noise kept me from falling back asleep and I wanted to scare it away. So I got up and went to open the blinds, but screamed when I lifted the blinds at the sight of Mrs. Rose trying to pry the window open with a pair of pliers. Once she saw me, she started banging on the window with the pliers. The dogs started barking now, and I quickly got up, told the dogs to follow me, grabbed my phone, and ran to a room with no windows, which was the bathroom, locking the door just in case she got in. I called 911 and explained the situation, quickly giving them an address from what I could remember. She said that the police would be there in 10 minutes, which for the area I was in is pretty good considering their house is in a pretty rural area. I had gotten the dogs to be quiet and put them in the closet connected to the bathroom to make sure she didn't hear them. I was trying to stay calm, and I could still hear the pounding on the window as I continued to talk to the operator, and then I heard glass shatter. I cursed under my breath, trying not to cry. I was really scared and pretty much ready to cry from the fear of being beaten to death by someone who is clearly not in the right state of mind. I was whispering what was happening to the operator, hiding in the back of the bathroom in the tub. After about 4 minutes of pretty much silence, I heard footsteps, and I could see feet under the other side of the door, and I cursed to myself again. I then see Miss Rose get on her hands, looking under the crack, and I mistakenly let out a gasp. She gets up, quickly pounding at the door, and I can tell she's still using the pliers. I am at this point crying, asking the operator where the police are, to which she responds, 3 minutes. Those 3 minutes felt like forever. I screamed at Miss Rose to please go away, and she screamed back that I shouldn't be here. Once I heard the sound of police cars, and about a minute later, them trying to kick in the door, I felt a little better. I was told to stay on the line until the intruder was caught, and that the police were trying to get into the house. Eventually, they did get into the house, and I yelled to get their attention. Not that they needed it, she was still banging on the door. Once they got into the room, she was told to drop her weapon, and she obeyed, saying that she didn't do anything wrong. They got her in cuffs, and a police officer told me that it was okay to unlock the door, to which I slowly got up and unlocked the door. After being taken to the police station and giving them my story for the report, I went to my parents' house. I was just too scared to be alone. The next day, I called Mrs. Brown and explained the situation. I got full payment even after telling them I wasn't going back to the house. They called me a few days later, saying that Miss Rose was under the influence of drugs, and in her words, she told the police that she decided to take care of the robber, me, herself, and that she did nothing wrong. She was charged with breaking and entering, which is kind of ironic. After that, I quit dog sitting, and I'm a lot more paranoid and always make sure my doors and windows are locked. So, Miss Rose, let's not meet again. This happened years ago in the 80s when I was 19. I live in a small town in the south, and it was common to have bonfires in the woods on the weekends in the fall. My friend and I, both female, went to a spot where a few others were hanging out in an open area of the woods. There was a fire, and we were all standing around drinking wine coolers and beer, just talking and hanging out. The main subject being a friend of ours who went missing a few days earlier. He was the kind of guy everyone knew, but I wasn't close friends with him. My friend is talking to someone, and a guy comes over to me and starts making small talk. He seemed a little weird, and I only knew him as the guy who dated a girl I went to grade school with. I couldn't quite understand why, but I felt a chill and an eerie feeling while he was talking. So much so that I walked away in the middle of this conversation and grabbed my friend and told her that we needed to leave now. She seemed a bit confused, but could tell by my tone that something was wrong. When we got to the car, I told her I couldn't explain it, but I just felt really uneasy, so we left and didn't think much else of it. A couple of days later, the guy's body was found in a shallow grave in the woods, and it was soon discovered that he was murdered over a dispute about a girl by none other than the weird guy making small talk with me at the fire. I still get creeped out thinking about how casually he was just out in the woods, hanging out, knowing that he had murdered a guy, and then everyone was discussing the missing friend in front of him. A twist to the story was just a few years later, he escaped prison and was on the run for about a week. I worked at a movie store at the time, and one day a woman came in to rent a VCR and movies. She was on some kind of drugs, and very obviously high. She was all over the place, and her eyes were wide, and she was talking nonstop. She proceeded to tell me that she was staying at a cabin at the lake with B, the escaped murderer. I acted normal and began filling out the info for her to rent, and I told her I had to get something from the back. I called the law and told them what she said, and they ended up following her and catching the guy again. Lots of creepy encounters growing up in the 80s. I loved growing up then, but definitely had a lot of close calls and weird encounters when I was younger. This happened about 5 years ago, and I've never had the chance to tell many people about the level of crazy that happened that evening. I met a guy on a dating app, of course, and we chatted a few days on text. I was getting very normal vibes from the conversations, so I agreed to meet up. His profile had him living in the town next to mine. We set the date and time at a local bar or restaurant, and it was only about 5 to 10 minutes from my home. I was getting into the car, and he texted me to tell me that he was running late because he was driving home from Pittsburgh. Now, that is at least a 5-hour drive from where I live. At any point in this entire time frame, do you think that he could have mentioned it earlier in that 5 hours that he was likely driving? So he said he needed to push it back, and I agreed. Red flag number 1. I got to the bar at the time we moved it back to, and he was not there yet. I get a text telling me that he was 15 minutes away and to order him a drink. Order and pay for your drink? Red flag number 2. I was chatting with a couple next to me at the bar, and I had already decided to finish my drink and then leave. I did not order his drink, by the way, and all of a sudden, he shows up. He was reeking of cigarette smoke when I had put no smokers on my profile. Red flag number 3, but figured that he was there and at least see what happens. He wanted to move to a more quiet area of the bar, so we moved to the other side. No big deal. He is acting really erratic, and then he says that we should dance. No one is dancing, so no. He put his hand on my head and pulled my bangs back and said,
I just want to see your whole face.
Okay, dude, get off me. Red flag number 4. Some friends and coworkers of mine showed up and went to sit on the other side of the bar. I introduced them and figured that was it. This psycho kept asking me for cigarettes that I did not have, kept bumming them off of people as he went outside, and I knew I was done. I actually knew at the beginning of the night, but was already there. I asked for the bar tab and it was $80, but decided to suck it up and pay it myself while he was outside, and then try to leave. I know the bartenders and figured the guy would stiff them, so I did not want to leave without paying. I went over to my friends to say goodnight, and one was pretty drunk and asked me to drop him off at home, since it was literally right on my way anyway. I agreed, and we started to head out. Psycho dude comes in just in time to see me leaving and asks what's going on. I told him I was leaving and giving a coworker a ride home. It was a male coworker, and I am female. He looked at me like I killed his puppy and walked right back out the door of the smoking area side of the bar. Red flag number 1,000,000 at this point. The bartenders and manager had been watching his interactions all night and told us that they were going to escort us to my car. So we get in the car and drive the coworker home. On the way, I am blasted by calls and texts from Psycho Dude telling me that I need to drive him home and to come back. I'm like, WTF? However you got there, you can use that to get home or call an Uber. He kept texting, so I blocked him. I woke up in the morning and curiously looked at the blocked texts, and I had one that was sent around 9 a.m. that said,
Hello, beautiful. Had a great time. And you give nice hugs.
I'm not sure what was wrong with him, but holy hell, of course, I never spoke to him again. So about 7 years ago, I had an online date who, after I told him a second date wouldn't be happening, decided to show up at my place of work. Needless to say, after that, I was extremely hesitant to dive back into the pool of online dating. In fact, since then, I can count on one hand the number of men that I've dated from online, but my sister and my best friend have both met men over the last year on an app that connects through Facebook. It's used to help filter out catfishes and also try to find mutual friends of friends that would match what you're looking for in a partner. So over the last month, I've been talking to guys here and there, but hadn't yet really found one I was ready to move beyond text with. Then this guy came along. We chatted in the app and he was really nice and seemed safe. After almost 3 weeks of daily texting, I agreed to a date. For the first time ever, I did not stalk his social media profiles because I wanted to stop self-sabotaging. I tend to dig so deep that I know too much before the date and have already made my decision that there will be no second date. Yes, I am extremely paranoid. So I show up to the first date and it's okay. He's mostly quiet and kind of shy, but polite. I know I have a big personality and can dominate the conversation, so I decide to give him a second shot. As the week leading up to date 2 goes on, I start to get apprehensive and tell myself not to sabotage this. I realize because I didn't want to stalk his profiles, I don't know his last name, so I text him and ask. He seems hesitant to tell me. He asks me why I need to know, so I respond jokingly that I typically ask before the first date so I can know who my murderer is, but we're beyond that, and now I simply want to know who I'm dating. It takes him a while to respond, but he sends it finally, and then doesn't text again for a while. I keep my promise to myself and don't social media stalk him. I tell some friends who start to seem hesitant about me meeting him again. Date 2. I show up at the restaurant, my choice, and it's pretty empty, so there's plenty of parking right up front. I park and wait. I see another car pull in, assuming it's him. He drives past all the open spots, my car included, which he knows because he walked me to it after date 1. He parks over at the side of the building, gets out, walks past my car, and texts that he saw me in the lot. It seemed a little awkward, but I ignored it. We enjoyed the date and spend an hour and a half talking on and off until the restaurant closes. We discussed where in the city we live, general directions, and the fact that we lived in those areas our entire lives. We also discussed social media, and he claims that he has no social media account. This should have been a red flag, since the app takes Facebook. Although the conversation was much better, I wasn't sure that I was ready to tell him that I wanted to see him again, so I figured I would go home and think about it. He walks me to my car, but walks uncomfortably close behind me. I ignore this and turn to awkwardly hug him and say my goodbye. I don't open the car until he's walked away after a bit of a pause. I leave and get out on the road to head home. There aren't many cars in that area as it's a heavily restaurant-laden area and most are closing for the night. I get up to the main road I'd need to turn down to go the direction I live, and notice the car behind me gets into the turn lane. I was not going home because I actually wanted to make a quick stop at the grocery store to grab some items I needed for dinner the following night. The light turns red and they sit extremely far back. I look in my mirror and realize it's him. No big deal. I'm sure it was just a coincidence that he was going this way. There are other stores this way as well. I refuse to become paranoid and overthink things, so I get up to the intersection the store is at and note that he's still in the far lane, so I hop into the left-hand turn lane to get to the store and notice he cuts over 2 lanes to get behind me. That seemed odd, but maybe he didn't know where the entrance to this shopping center is. Still a really odd coincidence that he'd be coming this way, especially without seeing a text or something acknowledging he's behind me. I mean, we're the only 2 cars on the road. I pull into the store and note that he pulls in 1 row before I do. I decide to do a loop around the lot and pull back out onto the service road. I slowly drive back to the main road, noticing he gets out of his car and scans the parking lot. Not a casual scan, like, is there a better parking spot? But a prolonged, where are you? Scan. I get back on the road and drive all the way to another out-of-the-way grocery store that I actually used to work at, knowing it's a safe place that will be on a more heavily populated end of town, with some friends who will be there to make me feel safe. Needless to say, I haven't heard from him since, and I think he knows I know. It took me a while, but I found his social media. His first name was not what he told me. I dug through my texts with him until I found a screenshot he'd sent me of an Instagram page, which listed mutual followers. Another red flag I should have remembered. He obviously had an Insta. I started digging through the accounts listed until I find one that's not private and find his profile. This leads to the ability to reverse Google image until I find his Facebook, which has a different first name and a city that's nowhere near where he claimed he lived. Time to delete my dating profile again. We've all had bad dates, right? This is the only date I've had to date that rang every alarm bell and waved every red flag. I'll preface this by saying that I don't go on many dates, but when I do, I make sure that I follow safety protocol by only meeting my date in public places, let either family or friends know where I'm going, and park in a populated place close by to wherever we meet. Anyway, this date initially suggested we meet at his house to watch a movie and have a few drinks. And I said no, I don't feel comfortable with that and I only want to meet in public. He seemed okay with this, but then brought it up a few more times, and I said that if money is an issue, we could meet up another time or forget about it altogether. But my date backtracked and went with my idea of meeting at a cafe I chose that I was familiar with and was equidistant to where we both lived. Anyway, he turns up in a 2-door car. This detail is relevant, and goes into the cafe, and I follow behind and introduce myself. After a polite introduction, things began to get weird. I order a Coke, and he says,
"Don't you want a drink? I was going to pop into the bar,"
which is connected to the cafe,
"and get one."
I say no, I'm not drinking, and he looks at me like, WTF? As if I'm being unreasonable. I already explained in messages that I don't drink as I'm on medication, so having to re-explain it again pissed me off. He seemed disappointed and goes to order a cider from the bar while I get a table. Anyways, we sit down with our drinks, and date immediately goes on about going back to his place again, even though the original plan was to stay here and order food, and I already stated that that was not happening. He says something along the lines of having a few drinks and eating at his place, and I say we don't have to eat, we can just have our drinks and leave. He gets defensive and says that he has money but prefers it if we go back to his. I make a joke and say, "You're not a killer, are you?" And instead of laughing it off, he stares at me uncannily and says,
"You don't think I would hurt you, do you?"
I laughed uncomfortably and said, "Of course not, but really, I'm relieved this date won't be going any further." Date suddenly says,
"Are you going to follow me in your car? Because that wouldn't make sense. How about we go in my car? But I've got packages in the front, so you'll have to squeeze in the back, and I'll drop you back off to your car after."
In reality, that made less sense to me than following his car and driving home from this house. The fact it was completely illogical made it even more creepy in my mind. Every alarm bell was going off at this point. I said, "Look, I don't want to go to yours, and your insistence is giving me the creeps." Date looks shocked, mumbles something about needing the toilet, and excuses himself from the table. A few moments later, I see him through the cafe window, getting into his car and driving off. Massive bullet dodged, in my opinion. Also, the fact that his car didn't have back doors made it even more sinister, because imagine if something happened in the car and I couldn't escape. When I was between 9 and 11 years old, my family owned and ran a corner shop in the UK, a small local shop. The shop was in a very old building, which had a previous incarnation as a pub and boarding house. From the day we moved in, my 3-year-old younger brother, Mom, and I all hated our house above the shop. There was a horrible, unwelcoming feeling in the living accommodations upstairs. I always felt watched and just uncomfortable. My brother had horrible nightmares, wouldn't sleep a night in his own room, but could never articulate why. My parents totally redecorated his room in a style he chose, American football theme, but he still refused to ever sleep in his bedroom. We all chose to stay downstairs in the small room behind the shop rather than spend any time upstairs. It also had a beautifully decorated bedroom upstairs. Night after night, I had horrible nightmares about a woman coming to my room and lying down on top of me. I would feel heavier and heavier until I couldn't breathe. I was 9 to 11 years old at the time. I never saw this woman in any detail, but would feel her come in, lay down on me, and crush me until I woke up. Thankfully, after 2 years, we moved out and I put my memories of the woman down to childhood bad dreams or a distorted memory. After we moved out, my dad converted the building into a number of flats and we kept it for years, renting the flats out. 30 years have passed. Last week, my parents were visiting. We got to talking about that house, and my mom said how much she hated living there. I agreed, and I told them about how I used to have horrible, scary dreams about a woman coming and laying on me. My dad looked really shocked. He then told me about one of his tenants who had rented one of the flats from him. He chalked him up as a weirdo. He stayed about 6 months. When he left, he told my dad all about the woman who would come in most nights and lay down on top of him until he felt he couldn't breathe. That's why he was moving out. So I've been stewing on that, and I just didn't know where to share, and I joined Reddit just to post my story. So at the time when this happened, I was probably about 16 years old. I used to stay up playing games at night with my buddies, which, if I got too loud, would warrant a late-night visit from my mom, telling me to keep it down. It was late one night, and all the lights in the house were off. My bedroom door was cracked, and looking into the hallway, and it was just pitch black. So, out of the corner of my eye, I swear I see what I thought was my mom, with her head barely in the gap of the door and the door frame. It looked like she was yelling at me, or at least seemed upset, but I couldn't hear her since I was wearing my headphones. So I take my headphones off, and I go, "What?" And I just stare into the pitch black before I realized that my mom was definitely not there, and was not yelling at me. That house used to give me weird vibes, and I absolutely hated my sister's room growing up. Once she left for college, I kept her door closed at all times. I ended up telling my family about it years later, and apparently my sister and my mom have had a few weird experiences in that house as well. That was my first and only, what I believe was, paranormal experience I've ever had. So, my dad died 5 years ago. It was a freak car accident while he and my older brother were driving home from some sports event that they'd gone to. My dad was larger than life in every sense of the word. He was 6 feet 8 inches tall, covered in tattoos, and had a laugh that I swear you could hear across the country. Him and his twin brother, they were identical. played so many pranks on us while growing up that we sort of just got used to it. That has not changed. Only now, dear Dad has the final laugh. The night of his funeral, my uncle and I were sitting together in the backyard. Uncle was telling stories about Dad and some of their wild teenage years, and I remember so badly wanting to hug my dad. All of a sudden, my uncle and I hear the unmistakable sound of my dad laughing, followed by the back door slamming shut. Uncle and I stare at each other, wide-eyed, and then burst into laughter, because yeah, that's my dad for you. The door, in case you're wondering, turned out to be locked from the inside. Uncle and I were the only ones home at the time outside of my Rottweiler Beast, who cannot lock deadbolts, and it took an hour for us to find the spare key. My dad liked to move our spare keys around because it makes it harder for robbers to find. He's continued to prank us over the years. Our keys go missing, your phone will start blaring his favorite song at 3 a.m. out of nowhere, or you'll wake up to the sound of my dog growling that distinct rowdy rumble that he's only ever used while playing with my dad. His laughter is always heard, as well as the scent of Old Spice, his favorite cologne. We miss him every day, but he always manages to remind us that he gets the last laugh nowadays. When I was in elementary school, I think 7 and 9 years old. Sorry, I don't remember the exact age I was. I just know that I was in elementary school. I had a nightmare that for some reason I never forgot. The nightmare takes place at my grandmother's house in the front yard. I remember sitting there and seeing a red cap floating. I knew that was the ghost of a boy around the same age as me. That boy was throwing a ball at the end of my grandma's house. I had a feeling that he wanted to play with me, but I was terrified. I wanted to run, scream, call for my grandmother, but I was paralyzed. Meanwhile, the invisible kid kept playing with the ball like I wasn't there, but I knew that it was him who wouldn't let me leave. Suddenly, my cries for help were answered, and a white-winged horse came to me. I suddenly felt at peace, and the dream ended. It may all sound like the product of imagination. Maybe I've heard too many stories about angels, mystical beings, ghosts, and that's all that it was, right? However, my brother is almost 9 years younger than me, so at the time I had the dream, he was either a baby or wasn't even born yet, so there's no way I told him about the dream at that time, or that he would remember it. I have never talked about my dreams with him prior to the incident that I'm going to mention next. Years go by, and I was now in my 20s, and my brother was a teenager. We were all at my grandma's house, parents and my aunt included, for a barbecue. While we were eating, we started to discuss paranormal stuff and dreams. For some reason, I remembered the dream and shared it with everyone. After I finished my story, my brother mentions that he dreamt about the same invisible boy with a cap when he was around the same age I was when I had the dream. He mentioned that he felt terrified and paralyzed too, but nobody came to save him like in my case. I'm not sure if it's a weird coincidence or if my grandmother's house is haunted.